Hello, folks, and welcome to the Season 1 finale of Author Adjacent, a podcast about the journey from hobbyist writer to professional author. I'm your host, Michael Vadney. If you're listening to this, you might not be comfortable calling yourself an author. Even I'm not there yet, but I am Author Adjacent. I started this podcast as a fellow journeyman on the path from writer to author in the hope that what I have learned along the way will help you fulfill your own writing dreams. And just a reminder, Author Adjacent is still partnered with Moonlit Getaway for what might be the foreseeable future. Moonlit Getaway is a multi-genre online literary journal set to begin publication on September 23rd of 2024. I'm telling you about it now because their grand opening contest is currently accepting submissions in the categories of visual art, flash fiction, and poetry. The contest is free to enter, and the deadline for submission is August 1st of this year. This is a great opportunity for author-adjacent writers looking to dip their toe into the world of publication, as many of the runner-ups will be offered space on their online journal. Visit moonlitgetaway.com for details. I'll have a link in the description if anyone is interested, but now back to the episode. Since this is the Season 1 finale of Author Adjacent, I thought it would be appropriate for today's topic to be second draft. I've been working through my own second draft since the beginning of this year, making this the perfect time for this episode. If you're about to start or are still working on your first draft, check out episode 1 of Tackling the First Draft for 5 strategies to help you get through the first pass of your novel. The first draft was our rough draft, where we had one simple goal: make the story exist. And before we get further into this episode, I just want to say, congratulations on getting this far. Many writers don't, and I'm sure it took a lot of dedication and discipline to get here. Let's keep that gumption up and carry it into our second draft, because I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. The first draft is likely hot garbage, and you're going to need all the grit you can muster to transform it into a proper second draft. If you've been listening to the show for a while, you will know that I believe pantsing might get you there, but planning definitely will. This is especially true for the second draft. For most writers, a completed first draft is an intimidating ball of semi-developed characters and plots that's pulling itself in all directions and dividing by zero. That's to say, it's undefined and unclear. You could dive into the chaos armed with nothing but a fully inked red pen and go page to page again and again, but this is likely to devolve into a never-ending process, and you still might not have a coherent story by the end of it. So pantsers, discovery writers, gardeners, you fearless wordsmith who prefer to let the story burst from you without a care in the world for structure or blueprint, believe me when I say that you will need a plan for the second draft. Lucky for all of you, I have one. And here it is, my 4-step plan for sharpening your second draft. Step number 1, take a break. That's right, the first step is to step away from the story. This may seem ridiculous, but it's highly recommended by the writing community as a whole for one crucial reason. You're too close to the work. If you were to immediately jump into editing after finishing your first draft, you are likely to overlook crucial errors and inconsistencies in your work. This happens because when you read lines you just wrote, your mind will fill in the gaps of knowledge a first-time reader cannot. You, as the writer, know what you meant by describing the building as tall, dark, and handsome, but the reader who doesn't have the benefit of your knowledge or intent might not realize you were trying to convey that this was a medieval Gothic church. You, as the writer, may think that you described the protagonist as gruff and irritated in an emotionally tense scene, while the reader thought they were just gassy. By taking a break and forgetting the intention of the story, you will be able to better see the sentences as they are and not as you intended. By no means should you stop writing during this break. You've busted your ass trying to build this writing habit, and you're damn well not going to let it fade now. Start another project, preferably something completely different that will get you out of the headspace that you were in for this first draft. During my break, I started working on this podcast, compiling my knowledge and research for the first few episodes of Author Adjacent. Hey, Michael, how long should I take a break before starting my second draft? That is a great question, bigger, gruffer me. As with most things in writing, everyone is different and will require a different span of time before they can start disassociating from the story. I took a month off, and it was helpful to get away from the story, to take a break and forget all the intentions that I had for scenes and characters and everything else. But I definitely felt that I took too long away from the story. It might have been my impatience to make progress on the book, or that the first draft had taken me such a long time that I'd already felt the disconnect with the first half of the story. But I felt that by the time I'd gotten back to work on the novel, I'd lost so much gumption and momentum. I think for future projects, I'm going to take a 2-week break and see if I can achieve the same level of detachment to carry into the next step. Step number 2, read the first draft. After you've created some distance between you and the story, it's time to take stock of what is going on with this big old mess and see what is worth salvaging from the first draft. And the only way to do that is to read it. You may cringe or groan at what a younger, more naive you thought was clever, but remember that almost all first drafts are bad. That is why we call it the rough draft. It's a jagged rock covered in the dirt of our imperfect mind. But before we can smooth those edges or crack it open to see what gems are inside, we need to know what's wrong with it, which is why this initial read is important. I implore you to not make changes during this read-through. Fixing a typo here or there is fine, as I know many of you just can't help yourself, but the goal here is to not fix the draft. It's to get through it as fast as possible and get a big picture sense of what you're working with. While you're reading and resisting or not resisting to fix your typos, you should be doing a couple things. First, after you finish each chapter, write yourself a 2 to 3 sentence synopsis of what that chapter is about. This will save you time later when you're slicing and dicing and rearranging your story, or when you're trying to track down what chapter a certain event happened in. And second, add to your list of big problems. This list may have already manifested itself during the first draft when you realized you made big consistency errors, but kept going like the trooper you are. Or it may have spawned during step 1's break, when you couldn't help yourself. In any case, if you don't have a separate list of big problems in the story, start one now, and add to it as you come across things that will require massive changes to fix your novel. By the time I finished my first read, I had a long list of big problems. My 3 main characters were in rough shape, with each being only slightly different versions of the same bland mold. I had the angry one, the bitchy one, and the wusses. On top of that, my magic system, world building, and scene setting were all over the place, as I struggled to decide what kind of environment my story would take place in. Worst of all, my plot made 0 sense. There were so many parts where a character's problem was easily solved by an already established plot mechanic, or other areas where I simply failed to explain the sequence of events that led the story to where it is. I share all of this not to bemoan my writing, but to show that my first draft was putting the rough in rough draft. While not required, this was also the step where I took all of my chapters that were in separate Google Doc files and brought them together in Scrivener. For the unaware, Scrivener is an organization and writing app for authors. It's popular enough to almost be considered a standard, but not everyone uses it. It's a nifty tool with a lot of customizable features, but don't think I'll be using it again after this project. While many of the features are great, there are a lot of quality of life improvements I'd prefer to be implemented before I would consider using it again in the future. By the end of step 2, I had my chapters organized in Scrivener with a quick synopsis for each and a list of everything I could find wrong with my first draft. Now, it was time for solutions. Step number 3, plan the revision. Whoa. You thought we were going to start writing draft 2 by now? I like the enthusiasm, but there's a big old pile of crap that we call the big list of problems that needs to be addressed before we get to the fun part. After step 2, you should have a sense of what's working in your novel and what isn't. We fix the latter by addressing the big list of problems we made in the previous step. For every item in the list, brainstorm solutions and write down anything that may solve the problem. Once you have your list of solutions, pick the one that resonates with you the most. I know that sounds easy to say and hard to do, which is why I have an example. In my story, I have a main character called Kindell. In the first draft, he was instrumental to multiple plot points as his actions triggered multiple events that progressed the story. But his character arc and personality was nothing more than, "Grr, grr, I hate the king, I want revenge, I'm just a little ball of rage." It was boring. I struggled with a solution for a while, trying to figure out how I could change his personality, backstory, or character arc to make him more relatable and an enjoyable character. Eventually, I gave him a subplot that introduced a new character goal that conflicted with his primary desire of revenge for his family. I went through the whole list like this, starting with the biggest problems that would affect the most pages. As the list of big problems got shorter, the solutions became more clear as solutions to previously fixed issues informed me of what I should do with what was left on the list. Once you have your solutions, it's time to go through the first draft and note all the changes that need to happen and where in order to implement your solutions. This is notably the most difficult part of writing the second draft. It's one thing to say in a list that these solutions are now part of the story. It's something entirely different to start the balancing act of noting in which chapters the book will showcase these solutions. But just like with solving the big list of problems, start with the solutions that affect the most pages or chapters. As you make your way through the list, the gaps and spaces in your story will inform you of which solutions need to go where. This is also a good time to rearrange, break apart, and smoosh together chapters as needed to implement your solutions. Plotters, revisit your outline and make sure you've kept to your narrative structure. Pantsers, choose a narrative structure that matches closely to your story and do the same. If you have no idea what I'm talking about when I say narrative structure, check out episode 2 of Author Adjacent, Narrative Structure, because maps save time. Once you have sliced, diced, and rearranged your chapters with notes pertaining to the solutions of your big problems, you're ready for the next step. Step number 4, write the second draft. You made it! You're finally here! It's time to write the second draft. After all this prep work, your first draft should be unrecognizable from the slimy ball of confusion it was before. Why slimy? I don't know. Things happen, and we weren't going to ask questions. But now you have what is essentially an outline for your story, born from blood, sweat, and tears that you put into the first draft. That's right, Pantsers. I got you to write an outline. Thank me later when you have a book. This step will be reminiscent of the first draft, and you can fall back on many of the habits that got you through the initial pass of your story, but there will be some noticeable differences. You may find that writing the second draft is much slower than writing the first. While in the first draft, you could bull rush your way through, purely focusing on making the story exist. The second draft is about savoring each scene and making sure the plot makes sense to the reader. This second draft will be very different from your first draft, and that's okay. This is why we didn't spend time editing our first draft. Well, that is if you were following my strategies for writing your first draft. As you progress through this step, keep in mind that the end product of the second draft won't be perfect, but this is where it will start to feel like a real cohesive book. This is actually where I am now in my own journey. I've aimed to tackle 2 chapters a week with varying degrees of success, and I've got to say, getting to this point is a magical thing. Much of writing can feel like swimming in an ocean with no land in sight, but it's at this stage of writing the second draft that I can see the story I've created, and no matter what happens, I'm proud of what I've accomplished, and you should be too. Keep an eye out for a future episode on the third draft, because it's the third draft where we will learn to polish our story until it truly shines. Alright folks, that is going to wrap up the Season 1 finale of Author Adjacent. I'll be taking the next 4 weeks off as I take a break, get some writing done, and plan for the future of this podcast. Thanks for hanging out with me today as I talked about my plan and experiences with writing the second draft. Once again, I'm Michael Vadney. If any of this was helpful or even just gave you a good chuckle, consider supporting the show by leaving a review on your podcast platform of choice or telling a friend about the show. For more Author Adjacent, you can follow me on X at Author Adjacent, or shoot me an email at authoradjacent@gmail.com with your burning questions, comments, or topic ideas. Now remember, the journey from writer to author might be long, but until then, let's be author adjacent together.